Hello and welcome to my channel, The Orchid Hut. My name is Dana and thank you for taking some of your time today to watch one of my orchid videos. This one is going to be a repot of a Latouria type Dendrobium that I purchased, maybe last fall sometime. So it has been in my care for maybe 5 or 6 months now. It was blooming last fall when I purchased it, so I'll insert a photo of the blooms, and I'm hoping, of course, to be able to have it rebloom for me this year. It is Dendrobium rotostictum number 1 crossed with Little Atro. And it was featured in a video over the winter. It was attacked by spider mites and used neem oil to eradicate that problem. It took several treatments. So it does have a little bit of damage on some of the leaves from the spider mites, but not too bad. It has recovered nicely. It is also putting on new growth right now, so this is a nice new cane happening right here. And I was waiting to see if it was going to do a few more, and it has. There's another new cane starting right there, and then there's one to the interior which we can't quite see yet, probably until we get it unpotted. So it is sending out some new canes, and new roots will follow shortly thereafter. So it's a great time to get it into some fresh media for the growing season. I have a feeling it has been in this pot quite a while, but what it was planted in was rather chunky, so large pieces of bark. I'm seeing a lot of sponge rock in the pot, so it probably hasn't degraded too much, even though it's been in the pot quite a while. And for repotting today, I'm going to just use my standard Dendrobium type mix here. And let's go ahead and get started. I've already flamed my cutters from the previous job, so that's taken care of. I have a pot chosen, which will hopefully work out. And so let's see what's going on in this pot. Just a little update, I guess, on things in my world while I'm getting this out of the pot. The weather has now been unseasonably warm the last few days. We have approached 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and the last 2 or 3 days have really been humid. There's a little cold front pushing through this morning, but I don't feel it in the temperature or the humidity yet. But the forecast says that Friday night is going to go down to 49 degrees Fahrenheit. So again, a very huge swing in temperatures, and I've noticed that this past year. When it gets cold, it gets really cold, and when it gets hot, it gets really hot. And the really cold and really hot temperatures are kind of a little bit different than the usual seasonal temperatures that we're used to. I don't know if that's like, one of the indicators of how climate change works, but it definitely has been a bit different the last couple of years, noticeably different. Okay, so let's have a look here. Really large bark, sponge rock, some new root growth happening right here. So I want to try to be careful about disturbing any new root growth that I see. At some point, it might just be easiest to take this to the sink and run water through it to get all of the pieces out. Sometimes this larger bark chunks are a disadvantage when you're trying to unpot something. It seems that especially some of the finer rooted orchids really like to attach themselves to the larger pieces, and then there's almost like no way to avoid damaging some of the roots to get it off. So if it's stuck right now, I'm not going to force it. I will see what comes off under the tap. And if it's like stuck sponge rock, it's really not even going to matter if I leave some of that behind, because it wouldn't be degrading anyway. So the objective here is kind of twofold. Get out as much of this old media as possible without damaging the root system, but if some of these pieces don't want to cut loose, that's going to also be okay, and I may just leave some of it if it doesn't wash out. Okay. So you can tell that this orchid, for whatever reason, put out a lot of its older root system to the top of the pot. And once I run this under the tap, I'm going to be checking if that root system that was growing out of the pot is actually still viable. And if it is, I will probably try to get it a little bit closer to the media, and if it's not, I will trim it away just to tidy up this orchid. I always seem to be a bit fooled at the onset of one of these repottings. I think, oh, I'm just going to pull it out, and all that old media is just going to drop away. But it seems like I always get the orchids where it has to be picked out piece by piece. It's a good thing I don't mind doing it. So, in other news, you know, just as soon as I think the pathway is kind of clear and I'll have a bit more free time to do more orchid-y kinds of things, something else in life kind of always comes up and causes a bit of an interruption. Both of my parents are elderly and live in an assisted living facility not too far from my house. And I have had to make the decision to move them, which is never easy when you're dealing with older folks. And so it requires a ton of paperwork in addition to just dealing with their general usual health issues. And so that has been taking up some of my time. And in addition to that, my husband, who is 9 years older than me, both of his parents are still living. And they're beginning to need a little bit more help with things as well. Although, even though they're a little bit older, they're actually in better shape health-wise than my parents. So, you know, stuff we do when family calls. Just have to just take it in stride and deal with it as it comes up. I am an only child, so I don't have help from siblings or other family members. I pretty much have it all on my shoulders to deal with. And some people who have to deal with their siblings, with older parents, they, you know, might actually think, well, if I'm going to be arguing with my siblings over my parents' care, then it might just be better not to have to deal with that. But there are times when I wish I had a bit of help in certain areas. And so it goes. Okay, so I think this is pretty stuck right in here, and I don't want to force it too much. Let's see if I can get one more piece. Okay, so I think from here I'm going to go to the sink and see what else of this is willing to be washed out. And I'll be back with part 2 of the video. Okay, so back with part 2 of the video here. When I got to the sink, a couple of things happened. First of all, when I got to the center of where the bark was inside the pot, the bark was a bit more degraded than what was around the edges, and I was finding a lot of really soft pieces like this that were just breaking apart. So because you know, that was a little bit more broken down than I originally thought, I did try to get most of it out. There were some larger pieces of sponge rock that I was able to crush with my fingers, and after I crushed them, the smaller pieces flushed away rather easily. I probably don't have every single piece out, but I have 90% of it, and I think that will be perfectly okay. And also, as I was doing this, I was noticing new root growth in several places. So there's a little bit of new root growth right here, as well as right here, and some more new root growth here and here, and then even on this side. There were a few places where the root tips were broken, but I think because this is going to be going into active growth, it will recover just fine. Now, what we need to do next is check some of these gnarly looking roots that have grown out of the pot. And so what I'm going to be doing is feeling them, and if they are soft, mushy, papery, then that means that they're not living and they can easily be trimmed away. When this one has been in my care the last few months and I would water it and I would look at it, I oftentimes thought that those roots at the top of the pot kind of added to the character of the plant. They didn't bother me particularly, but now that I'm repotting it, if I see that something is clearly dead, I'll probably remove it, and it'll look a little neater at the top of the pot. And again, this is one of those root systems, and I've repotted orchids like this before. It's almost impossible to go root by root to get every single dead root off, but you can attempt to do some of it. Get the obvious stuff out of the way. And then there's a few, what I call sheaths that were still stuck to some of the canes on the inside, so I'll try to clean that up if I'm able to reach it without damaging anything. This is not the kind of job that you can get 100%, and it's really not worth the time to try to get it to be 100%. And in just a second, when I finish with this trim at the top of the plant, I will explain one more thing you can look at for cleaning up the roots on an orchid like this. Okay, that is pretty good. Okay, so let's look at the growth pattern of this orchid. It's actually kind of interesting. You can see that the center here is where the oldest canes are. And in fact, these canes are so old they have lost the tops of their leaves. And if any of these little bulbs here were really, really, really loose, I would twist them off. This one is a tad bit loose, but not too bad, so it's not worth trying to twist it off. But this is an indication of where the oldest part of the plant is. And oftentimes you can look at the roots directly underneath the oldest part of this plant, and you can say, those roots are dead, those roots can be trimmed away. But in this case, I'm not really seeing that. I'm seeing roots that are still viable, you know, underneath the entire plant. So I'm not going to be trimming any of that away. You'll also notice on this one that it has points of growth that are from both sides of the plant. So it's putting out a new growth right here on this side of the plant, and it's putting out a new growth right here on the opposite side of the plant. I don't see any new growth right up against these older bulbs, but if I look even on the back side right here, there is a new growth right in there. So new growth is happening in multiple places. So when I repot this, I'm probably going to center it. You might see some repotting videos where they say put the older part of the plant up against the edge of the pot because it's growing in the opposite direction, but that's not the case here. It's actually growing on this side of the plant and it's growing on this side of the plant. So we're going to be centering it in the pot, in the new pot. Okay, now I also don't want to overpot this. Dendrobiums tend to prefer having a bit tighter of a potting situation, and I am going to be growing all of my Latouria type dendrobiums in the bay window this growing season, so I'll be able to, you know, monitor how well this is retaining and or losing moisture, so that's not a problem. I do want to spray this root system because it's rather extensive and kind of a just in case measure. Hydrogen peroxide, 3% only. I have never had a problem with it burning any of the roots or causing any kind of harm whatsoever. Okay. Now, don't really need to worry about this pot clogging up at the bottom. It's not that big of a pot, and this new media is large. So I'm going to put a little in the bottom. Excuse me. And test how we're doing. Okay, so pause for a moment and tell me what you think. This came out of a square pot. I am attempting to put it in a round pot that is similar in size to its original pot. Maybe the tiniest bit larger at the top, but not necessarily larger at the bottom. So pause for a moment and think about what you would do. Okay, so what I'm thinking is that I need to go up at least one size in pots because I really don't want to cram this square-shaped root system into a round pot where it doesn't exactly fit. Sort of like the square peg in the round hole and it doesn't quite go. That's what's happening here. So let me take a second break and I'm going to come back with a better pot choice. Okay, so back for part 3. You know, as you get more and more into orchids, you really will find that you need to have various supplies on hand because there's nothing worse than getting into a job like this and realizing you don't have what you need to finish. So I would suggest always having an assortment of pot sizes on hand because I have moved up now from small to the next size pot. And because I did that, I wanted to put some large cork pieces in the bottom of this larger pot so that the drainage holes don't get plugged up. And now I'm putting like the first layer of the orchid bark on top of the cork chips. All right, now I just about always go with as small of a pot as possible to repot, but this is much, much better, and I'm hoping that you're able to tell that. The roots are still relatively close to the edge of the pot, which is kind of like where they like to grow anyway, but it's not wedged in there, and it will allow for several years of growth, 2 at least, maybe 3 if the media doesn't degrade too much. So once I do this, I shouldn't really have to touch it again for, you know, good 2 years. And having it undisturbed like that is what it would prefer anyway. So now I'm just going to fill in with the media, and we will check at some point that there's not a lot of airspace. I thought too that this orchid was potted just a tiny bit high in its previous pot, and it may not have been that way originally when these canes were new, but as the plant grew, it I think started growing up out of the pot a bit more. But I think now it might be a little bit better situated as far as level goes. So I'm poking down on the edges just enough to get the media to fall down in the crevices, and in just a second we're going to give it a good tap and we're going to check for airspace. Okay. All right, let's have a look. So as we go around the pot, there's a little bit of airspace here, but there's also a lot of roots. Coming around this way, everything looks okay. Looks okay. Maybe could use a little bit more right here. There, we fixed that. Okay, let me just see if I can work on this space just a little bit. The roots are very close right there, so that helped a little. Okay, now just a little bit more media on the top, and we should be good to go. It's very stable in the pot because, of course, it had a really good root system. Okay, and I think we are done. Latouria type Dendrobium repotted. I will give it a good water and find a decorative pot for it to go in, and then it will be living in my bay window for the rest of the growing season. Thanks so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this video or learned something new, please give it a thumbs up. The subscribe button will be coming up in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. Talk to you next time.